Okay, how's it going, everybody? It's great to be here and to talk a little bit about some of my work. This is a little bit of an update of a talk I gave last year that was really a little bit more rooted in the arts in connection to ecology. And of course, wellness and ecology are really closely linked. But after hearing this last talk, I also feel a little bit of an impulse to sort of like talk for a minute about what I do. I'm on composition faculty here, and I have a lot of students around here, which is great. And so my research, my creative research is to compose, and composing, making music can be done in a lot of different ways. But mostly what I'm talking about with this project which is not the only way that I make music, but one of the ways I make music, and what I spend a lot of time doing, is sort of this like planning process where you're putting all of the notes into a big fancy score, and that can be a really time-consuming and lonely process. In seeing the last presentation, just how the creative act is really important for us as people. That's very much connected with what I do, and I think it's probably driven me into projects like these, where I'm trying to do what I do as a composer in a room by myself with a piano and a score, to find some way of like tethering that to the world around me and the people around me, and that's led me to some really personally gratifying projects. This included but also working a couple years ago with the Athens Hip Hop Harmonic, where I got to work with Montu and some of the local artists, just being collaborative with music making so that it's a way to sort of build community, because I think that that's what the source of music is, even though I think a lot of what we do in our musical training, much like I take it in artistic and visual arts training, can be kind of removed from its roots of being a communal process. And so, anyways, now this gets really sciencey, and we will take a look behind the curtain of, some of these sort of ins and outs of making a particular kind of music that I've embarked on with this project. And so, this is a little bit of the story of creating a piece, and the name of that piece is turns out to be called Coastal Portrait: Cycles and Thresholds. It's about a 15-minute work for orchestra and electronics, and along the way it also turned into a museum installation that was just hosted the last 3 months at Georgia. The Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum in Savannah, Georgia. It's sort of right on the waterway there, and they did a I'll talk more about the installation in a moment, but the way that this really came about is because I was hanging out at the playground with my, at the time, 4-year-old, and chatting with somebody I ran into who's the mother of one of my kids' friends, who happens to be the head of the long-term ecological research project here at the University of Georgia, Dr. Amanda Spivak. And it turns out we had like a lot of family friends in common, because my dad is a marine scientist, and they had some like common colleagues up in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. But around the same time, I saw a call for a sort of supporting arts program called the Georgia Sea Grant Artists, Writers, and Scholars Program, which supports artists, including musicians. So there was, this year there was some like visual arts, a choreographer had a project, and this, which is still ongoing, to just engage with coastal ecology as part of the mission of the Georgia Sea Grant. And so this has sort of been growing over the past year and a half, and taking different directions. But ultimately, the composition now is done. It hasn't been performed yet. It's going to be performed on November 11th in Atlanta with the Georgia Tech Symphony Orchestra. But I have some samples to share of, even though it hasn't been played yet. Just in this conversation with a marine scientist, we started spitballing ideas for some kind of collaboration between marine science and music. ultimately what I learned about was this the Georgia Coastal Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Project, which I'll just say the GCELTER. That's like one of the, like, we don't always need the acronyms that we use, but we kind of need the acronym for that one. The GCELTER is really this big, it's been funded since the year 2000 by the NSF. It supports a whole lot of scientists studying the Georgia coast, and I'm probably not the best person to give a really good explanation of this because it has a lot of very, serious, hard science people that are running this. But this is, oh no, my image went away. What happened there? Oh, there it is. Okay. This is too much information, but this is their conceptual model of what all these scientists are working on together. Maybe I'll just sum it up and say, I'll read the title, which is the summing up of it, which is they seek to understand how these ecosystems function, how they change over time, and how they might be affected by future changes in climate and human activities. And then all of this is not maybe important for this scope of this talk, so I'm going to move on from that. Except to say that there's a couple of things that Dr. Spivak was really spoke a lot about that I thought was really interesting, that had to do with the carbon cycle and freshwater saltwater exchanges on the coast, and some of the projects she's been involved in, particularly looking at marsh grass populations and how they respond, how they're responding to a number of things, but among them climate change and sea level rise, which has an effect on water salinity and what kind of species grow in different areas. And so yeah, actually I'm going to jump forward and come back to this because this is really weird. It's not fully, there it is. This is when they say it's a long-term ecological research program, there's multiple sites there, and these are the different places on the Georgia coast where they're studying a variety of these things, but I'll get back to that. And so part of the project that I was really interested in was exploring data sonification and seeing if we could find a compelling way to take the data that these scientists are collecting, translate it into sound in an interesting way, and then incorporate that into a composition for orchestra. And so it brings up the question, what is data sonification? And data sonification is simply the presentation of data as sound. I mean, at a basic level, that's all it is. I think we're really familiar with data visualization. You'll see data usually communicated visually. We're very visual people. That's why you walk into a room and you see lots of TV screens but no speakers. And while it's a lot less common than data visualization, sonification may offer some advantages. It's uniquely situated to highlight changes over time. One of the things that I feel like I'm keenly aware of as somebody who works in music is a time-based art form. And something that my students probably hear me talk about way too much is that music is not immediate. You don't just hear a piece and then say, there it all is. I call this the visual fallacy, right? A lot of times we like to make a map of a piece. Like, this is Beethoven's Fifth, and here's the form of it, and you can just see it all on a screen in front of you. And it's like, look, that's very beautiful and perfectly balanced, and it must be good. But that's not how we experience music, right? We experience it moment to moment, and so the experience of sound moment to moment is really important to how we write. And so, there's a lot of disadvantages to trying to communicate data using sound, but one of the advantages is that it occurs over time, and you have to sit there and wait for it to be done. And so it helps us appreciate, even if it's not at scale, which it usually isn't, but it helps us appreciate the time domain, because the time domain is usually represented visually on an x-axis, and you see it all at once. And so maybe it's uniquely situated to highlight changes over time. In some instances, people who are really deep into data sonification, this is really an entire field, and it can be a little bit, what's the word? It contentious maybe about like what data sonification is for and what it's not for, and what's good data sonification and what's really bad data sonification. And I don't want to bring all of that baggage into this room, but it's hard to not, say that. Like in some instances, arguably, we can perceive patterns of regularity and irregularity in sound more readily than we can in common visual formats. A really important part of data sonification is simply its utility as communicating data for visually impaired persons. But the one that I'm probably tapping into most with this project, which is also maybe one of the more contentious ones, is that I think it just opens up interesting possibilities for collaborations between scientists and musicians or sound artists, and it really comes down to, at the end of the day, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I took a lot of data coming from this big collective project, and the purpose of it is not to explain what the data means in a way that these scientists would do in a proper scientific presentation or in an academic paper that really gives all of the context, details, and process. Imagine looking at a graph of visual data, and all the information is removed. All the information about what the shapes in front of you and lines represent, they're taken away. And in a way, the way that this project is being presented is kind of like that. It really lacks context for the individual data points. And we can provide some of that with a pre-concert talk, which is what we'll do. But at the end of the day, the goal here is really to find a way of creating a connection and to have sort of a textual interaction between scientific data, which also is a kind of a lonely process for them, right? Like these things can kind of get stuck in a study, and we have a hard time communicating that to the general public. So much so that, one of the things that really excited Dr. Spilak about this process was, the National Science Foundation wants us to do things like this because we need to have public outreach as part of our project. And it's like, okay, well, if there'll be an orchestra, there'll be an audience, so that's a thing. But that it's a way of just like, in a different format, in this communal ritual of having an ensemble perform music and people hang out and listen to that ensemble perform music, it's an opportunity to just sort of be aware of what we're doing and not just what scientists are doing, but what we are doing. What are we doing with our human activity to our environment, and understanding that we are very dependent on that environment. And even if we weren't dependent on that environment, we should still probably care about it. And so when I started talking about this project, the immediate response was, oh, cool, are you going to be taking recordings from the coast and incorporating that into your piece? And my answer was, no, that's not what we're doing. We're generating sounds electronically using data. But as it turns out, due to some twists and turns of the project, there are some sounds incorporated. I couldn't resist, but I'll get to that later. But for right now, I just want to talk about how can we take some of these measurements and some of the things that, this will be a sort of preliminary example, which was just trying to do some basic tests at first. And this one was pretty simple. Monthly peak air temperatures on Sapelo Island since 1957. And so I kind of created a basic instrument. You'll see some examples of this software. It's called MaxMSP. It's a place where you can sort of do object-based programming, and I'm teaching a class on it, and the students are probably stressed out about that class. But you can do a lot of sort of custom kind of programming in a visual way that's really helpful and commonly used by people in electronic music or multimedia arts. And okay, so now I'm gonna, forgive me while I jump around a little bit in my laptop here, because I have some examples I want to play. And now, of course, I'm struggling to find. I have too many files on my desktop. Look at this, Sea Grant project. Look, I have too many files in this Sea Grant project window as well. But I thought I did put some of them inside something that was called presentation samples. And so this was just sort of a screenshot, and I wonder if I'll have sound. This might be, oh, there it is. Okay, so like this is very, very preliminary. Actually, and it's a little hard to see, but you can kind of see the year rolling along here, the month. We lost some in the late 60s and 70s. I don't know what happened. There was a vacation, and now they're back. And so basically, you can see this is the mean temperature in Celsius, and that's just being translated to notes on the piano, basically. I mean, it's a really sort of rudimentary way of doing this, which is just to choose a scale to say this is, the lowest temperature we're ever going to see, and this is the highest temperature we're ever going to see, and then every monthly average temperature just gets spit out onto the keyboard. And there's a lot of other questions that can come up here, which people asked me after the last time I presented on this, which is like, why did you just use C major? Why didn't you use chromatic notes? Or why didn't you use microtonal notes and all the in-between notes? And it's like, well, I'm writing for an orchestra, and I'm not going too crazy with it. I'm writing in a way where we're still dealing with scales and notes, and so this was a test. Anyways, we're all the way up to 2015 now, and it hasn't driven you crazy yet. Well, is it driving you crazy? It might be. Maybe a little crazy. And, oh, that's it, okay. And so, I mean, what does this data actually tell you? Maybe this isn't communicating anything that we wouldn't be able to see very clearly in a graph, but it was a little bit of like a proof of concept of just take a parameter and translate into a sonic parameter. Temperature, it's like one-dimensional. Temperature is going to be translated into pitch, and we're going to get 12 of them. They're going to fly by really fast. And actually, musically, if we want to think about this musically, which I'm always inclined to do, even if it's an air conditioning, is, it's like, oh, it has a nice kind of rhythm to it. Why does it have this why does it sound like it's in 6/8? 16th notes flying by in 6/8. Why does it feel like that? Well, because it's months, right? And we have 12 months, and so you can generally assume that January or February is going to be the coldest temperature, and July or August is going to be the hottest temperature, and so it creates a flow of up and down that is maybe from the arbitrary decision to divide our data points into 12. But this was
12, by the way.
What's that?
Is it multiples of 12? Because every higher temperature is a higher pitch without regard to octave. Sorry, is it 12 or is it 48?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm only talking about 12 as the sort of pitch. The actual scale is, I've forgotten what the actual scale is. It looks like I scaled it to 50. It looks like it's covering about 4 octaves. So yeah, it's a bigger scale than just an octave. And that was just to sort of contain the pitch. And so there's a little bit of like a handbook to sonification or something, and with rules if you want to like really not get the sonification people mad at you. And one of them is you have to scale things, right? Like things have to, if you're going to translate something like temperatures to sound, if I just took the temperatures and turned those into, let's say, frequencies, like that's also kind of arbitrary because Celsius to Hertz they have nothing to do with each other. And they would all be really, really low, like subaudible frequencies that you wouldn't be, not subaudible, but near the lowest range of human hearing. So it's kind of useless. So we have to scale it. And so the scaling is kind of, it's not arbitrary, it's chosen to sort of highlight the range in a particular way that's up to the person setting those parameters. But you have to be consistent with it. And that's one rule that I followed very closely, which is I never change the scale of the data, because even though I'm not saying this is exactly what this data represents in the middle of an orchestra piece, because I don't want to have to talk in the middle of my piece, I still I'm still keeping the bounds the same across the board. And so that was where we started. But what I was really interested from the beginning of this project was working with spatialization. So another thing that I'm really interested in, sort of within my interests in electronic music, is I'm trying to keep an eye on time also. What time did I start? I just realized I didn't pace myself. Sorry.
About 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, so yeah, I'm doing okay. I was really interested in spatialization, dealing with really, my vision was to sort of have the orchestra on stage and have the audience surrounded in speakers. And part of the reason for that was data is being collected from all of these different sites, and they're all connected in particular ways. You'll see that, something that's further inland has like lower salinity because there's less of a saltwater freshwater exchange further in. And things kind of move with tide regularity. But the thought was, what if I do kind of like something not quite like what we just heard, but something kind of close to that, synthesizing sound using data, and take a couple of different parameters, sonify them, but do them for the same time domain across 8 speakers, where every single speaker is a representation of the data collected at a different part of the Georgia coast. And so like that was the idea. And yeah, so yes, there's our orchestra, and there's all of the speakers, which are, that's not where they're going. I don't know why I have this picture here. Ignore that picture. And so some examples of what I ended up actually creating for the piece, some that I didn't use the exact same sound, but the Sapelo Island thing, as I got later into the piece, really in the process of talking about one of the more alarming bits of data, which has to do with sea level rise and saltwater inundation of some of these coastal ecologies, was I wanted to sort of give a big picture of that. So I do actually use some of that Sapelo Island temperature data, and it kind of flies around the room. It's just sort of like a circular thing near the end of the piece. But a lot of it is really rooted in these two things. One is 8-channel from 8 different research sites where water temperature is translated into pitch, and the salinity, which is also sort of a representation of how much of the seawater is coming inland and how much it's going out, is density of notes. Like how many notes do we hear getting spit out of this? So if it's like really busy, like that's, lots of salt water has come in, and if it sort of gets really sparse, then it's calms down a little bit. And I use that system basically for 2 different ways of using this 8-channel system where we're getting all the data at once. One had more to do with water depth, and the other had more to do with water temperature. And then another one is annual marsh grass data. Every year they would go to these different sites and measure the height and flowering status of a particular species of marsh grass, and that's all, again, connected with studies of the carbon cycle and salinity. And so I want to just play some of these sounds in isolation. Again, we're only going to hear 2 of the... Oh, let me see really quick. That's okay. I think if I put this here, it will come out the right place. Bye. So sorry, part of the reason this software is called Reaper, it's where I sort of organize a lot of the sounds. Part of the reason I'm playing it through here and why I had to use my own laptop is because they are all in 8 channels, and this is just a way for me to fold them down into 2 speakers for us. But let me see if I can get our sound to come out. I hope it will. Oh, it's coming out the wrong place. And so, one more second. Sorry for the technical things. Where? Oh, Solstice Desktops. Look, they're right there. Cool. Okay, and actually I realized I'm grabbing the wrong. Okay. Actually, that's fine. Okay, so I'm gonna jump away from that for a second and just sort of show the instrument that we built. In my list of collaborators, I listed a lot of the scientists I worked with. I also have to give a shout out to one of our recently completed doctoral students who's sort of a guru with Max and coding because he helped build the digital instrument that essentially plays this stuff, and that's Jared Tubbs. Our dictation samples. Oh, nope, I didn't put that one in there. Actually, this is kind of interesting. This is ultimately like the sort of instrument that we created in Max to play all of these data points at once, because there are tens of thousands of them, and every single one of these little points is a data point that was measured at each of these, at 8 of the 11 sites. And then all of this was to sort of be able to translate this into sound. And this is just sort of coming out of a bad microphone, but it highlights a little bit of my process, because like I just did a screen recording with the microphone on the laptop running, surrounded by my 8 speakers in my office. And then I sat down at the piano and just started improvising with it, because at the end of the day, what I felt like the orchestra was doing was sort of being the human mediator with this data. The orchestra, what's happening in the orchestra for the most part is still just intuitively composed music. It's the electronics coming out of the speakers that are the data. And so, it's clipping up a little bit and it's very quiet, but all right, you hear me just like sort of like messing around on the piano, like along with this stuff. Most of which didn't really turn into orchestra music, but some of it did actually. Listening back on this was like a first improvisation, and some of these materials sort of worked their way in a little bit. Anyways, so it's very quiet and not very easy to hear. It's probably better to sort of play a little bit of this, and actually I'll just start from the beginning and play a couple minutes of this, and that'll more or less wrap up my presentation. There's something happening with the sound communicating through the system that's sort of like choppy and cutting off, which is weird. Yeah, that's weird. Never mind. I won't do that then. I'm not going to play a sample because we won't hear much of it very well. Anyways, I guess you have to come to Georgia Tech on the 11th to hear it. Yeah, well, and so actually, I guess in my last couple minutes, I can talk a little bit about, the other thing that happened was along the way, the museum in Savannah wanted to sort of feature these pieces, or feature the works that were created from the last couple years of Georgia Sea Grant support. And I sort of had the idea of like, what if I take some of these data sonification sounds that I generated through this project and basically replace the orchestra with 3D sound field recordings of the actual spaces. And so, there is this, I think I have like sort of a group of like photos in here, that ultimately I sort of, photos of Soundfield Journey. I sort of went around to not just the research sites. I mean, this is actually just sort of across from Sapelo, or down on sort of south side of Jekyll Island, getting some sound. It's a microphone that allows me to sort of record and capture not just stereo information or mono information, but a picture of where sound is coming from all around you. It's called a sound field microphone, and it's something that I like to use and then pipe into like these big speaker arrays with lots of speakers around you, because you can have a really sort of powerful, I feel like I can get a really powerful immersive experience of being sort of immersed in a sonic environment using these sound field technologies. And so I just spent some time going around to these different places that were nearby the research, some of the research stations, and getting some of these different environments. And the idea of the installation was, okay, just some of the electronic sounds coming in and out over the course of a sort of 20-minute loop. But the environments were essentially transitioning us with the flow over that course of time from the ocean into the woodlands, like from the ocean through some of the dune ecosystems into some of the marsh environments and into the woodlands and back out. And so it was kind of cool to just go around, and actually an experience that, this is I've been doing this for a number of years now, but going around and collecting sounds of environments I've found to be like a really therapeutic thing to do. So add that to your list. If you have terrible visual art skills like me, I can't even, the scribbling thing, I was like, oh, scribbling, I can do that. And then I'm like looking at scribbling, like, no, I can't do that kind of scribbling. You know, get a sound field recorder and just go around and record the sounds around you. It's really an amazing way to sort of become in touch with the sonic qualities of your environment. And it can be a little unhealthy and frustrating too. For instance, even in the most remote places in some of these environments, it's so hard to escape the sound of airplanes. Yeah. And I never really thought of that or noticed that before until I was trying to gather sounds for a project and just like screaming at the void, like, go away, airplane, you're ruining my sound sample. But in any case, so that turned into a sort of an audio installation that had this immersive speaker setup for taking us through some of these sonic environments while the data sonification sounds kind of creep in here and creep in there, outside of context, without a lot of information given, but just as a way of sort of saying, like, here's the world we live in, and here is what, like, tens of thousands of data points for people who really care about what happens with coastal ecology. And if anything, maybe it's just an homage to the work that they're doing, because maybe composers will talk about this on their panel. It can be a very narcissistic process, and sometimes like we're like, I'm constantly feeling like, how do I make this project not just be about like my music and my vision? Like I want it to tether it to other things, and so that's this. And I'm happy to take some questions if there are any. And thank you. Yeah.
I know, it's absolutely gorgeous. Thank you so much. Always the first one. I have a comment, actually. I grew up there, like right at Shawman's Bluff there that you had on your map. And so that's really neat to hear you talk about that stuff, because I used to go out crabbing and shrimping and fishing with my dad every weekend, and we would taste the water to see where the fresh and salt water had come in.
Oh, wow.
To see like what we were going to catch and stuff like that, you know, because it differed depending on how fresh or salty it was. That's really neat to hear that and hear those sounds linked to it. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Nigel, go.
Okay, so hi, Nigel. Nice to meet you. Thank you. That was beautiful. Just to say, in the kind of valuing of what you do, it seems to me that sound is the slowest energy that we perceive, mechanical energy, processed by the fastest fine system of the brain. So we know more about sound than anything else. And also that means why, for example, some work I do, we audify. I'm not getting into that debate, but what that means is simply directly drive the sound by the brain. And we discovered things through that were not known and not been noticed. What were those, 40 hertz systems doing? They're communication systems. Similarly, when we audify the genome, we found relationships that have not been picked up, either mathematically, Bayesian, whatever you try, we heard them. So in other words, there are things that don't come from other things. And the other thing is, in the valuing, just yesterday, day before yesterday, I was researching something by coincidence. 1975, a great arts entrepreneur called Richard DeMarco organized in Edinburgh a meeting of Buckminster Fuller, Joseph Beuys, the great German artist, and Tadeusz Kantor, the great Polish director, all met. Why? Because Ricky thought there's something really important just happened. It was the aftermath of the Six-Day War, had led to huge rises in oil prices, had led to turbulence in the world economy, such as not seen before, linking up to what was already foreseen to be ecological issues. That's, as far as I know, is the first instance of such a coming together in art. It wasn't in a scientific meeting or a political meeting. It was in an art meeting that was first debated. And I can remember Fuller saying, that we've got several jobs to do here. We have to propagandize. We have to make sure raise awareness, literation. We have to explain when we can. And the most important thing is what you're doing. We have to celebrate the beauty of our world. And what better way than the music? So congratulations. And I don't know if any of those positions resonate with you. Absolutely. And actually, I think my only response to that is just, I assume that there are
some artists, and I know there's some musicians in the room, is that after the, just only very recently in the last few weeks, I was put in touch with a national network of long-term ecological research. They have these LTERs all over the country, and there's one in Alaska Fairbanks that actually started this sort of artist collaborative, where there's like visual artists and musicians and doing collaborations with these ecology teams. And I was really excited to hear that, and then suddenly found all this other stuff that's going on all over the country. And so I've already roped in, some of the students into like, hey, be aware of this and go to this, virtual conference. But check it out. I mean, if you look up the LTER, I don't know. My email is here, and if anybody's interested in learning any more about this, I was excited to hear that. It seems like a small and relatively young professional organization, but it's all about long-term ecological research sites and the arts, and that's kind of exciting to hear that that's getting started.
I have a question. Oh, go. No, I want yours. Oh, no, you go first.
More just like a personal curiosity. I would imagine this took hours upon hours of work that you're doing with this project, months and maybe years. With like your clear excitement and passion for the project, how do you keep that when you are working alone at times? Sounds like often. How do you find that type of passion to continue to do something like this within music?
Well, I'm an introvert. I'd start there. I really embrace like my writing time is something that I feel really it's hard to protect, but I've always strived to be protective of it. I tell all my students like it's all about your creative practice. Like your own creative practice is something that you need to take really seriously, and it's hard when you're a student. It's hard when you're a grad student here, particularly. I know they have like these really hard classes and all this time, and it's like, oh, I didn't have time to write this week, and it's like, okay, well, like. If you're in this, you just have to put in the time. I mean, really, like, the data parts of it probably spent 30 to 40 hours of programming, many hours of standing around, getting bitten by mosquitoes, getting sound field samples. But the big thing for me was making the orchestra score. I mean, it's like, an 80-page full orchestra score that I just had to put in all the notes, and that I probably spent 120 hours collectively doing. But I've been working on it for a year. So it's like you have to be into the process, or else it's too much. You can't like I know some composers like they just hate writing music, but they love hearing the piece being performed, and like okay. But if you can't get on board with just loving the process, you spend a lot of time being miserable. And so I think that's for people who spend a lot of time doing any creative work that's really time intensive. Like you just have to accept that you're going to be underpaid for the amount of work that you're doing and the amount of time you're putting into it, but it's a calling, right? You have to be okay with just like, I need to do this anyways. So, I'm going to do it and put in the time because I think writing for large ensembles in particular, it's time consuming. I think it's a slog.
There's a question on that.
If I could just very quickly piggyback on his question real quick, something that really helped me was actually taking it out of my brain solely and actually identifying in my body where I'm feeling motivation, joy, energy, that kind of thing, and finding what activity wakes up that part of my body to get me back into that method. And again, it's like it looks different for every person, but just lean in. I didn't lean in for a long time, felt a lot of shame about, the weirder things that I do to get in that zone. Because they are weird and they are like very specific, and if something's not right, it's just not right and won't happen, and it's like Goldilocks of space, But it's like just sit with that and find it out, and I quite literally mapped it out for myself. I made a body map of like, okay, when I'm feeling stuck, how do I unstick that feeling, or when I'm stuck on this part of that data translation. So it's gonna feel weird and silly and stupid because it kind of is, but it's yours. So enjoy. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I like for me a big part of that is like if I'm getting really wrapped up in other people's music, that I have a hard time getting into it. If I go to the Dodd galleries and see some visual art or read some poetry or like anybody else's creative stuff that is not sound related, like that's it. Yeah, that all gets me into it, and then I find the space. But like I gotta get
Yeah.
the sounds out of my head, just like clear the palette. And so I think that's really important for anyone, regardless of medium. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I think we might be going over.
Yeah.
One last question, and
Yeah.
then maybe we can address those questions as we compose as well coming up, but yeah,
Oh,
let's
yeah.
go.
Yes, I'm just curious about, of course, I think you're merging human-made sounds and nature sounds of nature. What has changed in your aesthetic and ethical considerations of it? For example, like ownership of the sound. Or like how do you see it?
Yeah. Oh man, there's so much to unpack. And I don't know which way to, that's a really good question, but it's one I'll just spend like 3 hours talking about. So like, let's go grab a beer.
Or just one of the top that comes to
No, yeah. I mean, one is that I tend to be pretty far into one camp when it comes to sound and ownership. I'm kind of like, I don't really take ownership of a lot of things. I mean, when you put something in a piece and you put it on stage and I say, this is my piece, give me royalties for it or something, like, yes, there's ownership built in, but like in that sense, I kind of have a hands-off way of dealing with it. I do feel like, I'm creatively using the work of a lot of people, and I've been very sensitive I've been a little paranoid about that, like much more so than the Soundfield recordings that are coming from nature. It's like, okay, great, those go in, great. I can bring those around and share those. It's like sharing beautiful photography. It's just sonic photography, and I love it. The collected data, I've really been careful to try to be in touch with everybody and credit them in the score that collected that data, because they did not have this in mind when they were doing that work. But I do want to make sure that I'm not like tethering work that they've done. I think we should all be more protective of our data than we are. That's a completely different story. But certainly scientists who are collecting that data, they are protective of it already because that's like their life's work. And so I'm using it in a way that's like not the way that they intended. So I want to make sure they're okay with it. So I've tried to be communicative about that. Beyond that, this question of like human-made sounds and nature-made sounds, I didn't really think about it so much that way, but I've thought for the better part of a decade and a half now about the way my compositional practice as having a sort of continuum between sounds and music that I feel are sort of like organic, for lack of a better term, and sounds that are mechanical. And the sort of continuum of organic to mechanical is something that every single piece of music I've written for the last like 15 years is very much concerned with, that like where we hear things on that continuum. And so I'm kind of thinking about that all the time. In this case, sonified data is synthetic. It's synthetic, like sine tone's very simple synthesized sound, so it has a certain mechanical quality, but it's being driven by these really purely analogous sort of organic drivers, I guess. And so that kind of challenges my way of thinking about that, which just makes me more excited by it. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was absolutely